I can still feel the silence of that moment. The kind that presses down on your chest and makes it hard to breathe. I had walked into the room with hope stitched into every part of me, my heart carrying years of quiet dreams, only to realize in an instant that I didn't matter, not to the people who were supposed to matter most. I stood there, waiting for a face to light up, for someone to say they were proud, but all I found was absence. The chairs I thought would be filled with love were left empty, and the people I had carried through every storm in their lives had chosen someone else, somewhere else, over me. The betrayal wasn't loud or dramatic. It wasn't a slammed door or a shouted insult. It was quieter, more cutting, a decision made behind my back, a celebration I wasn't worth attending, a moment they decided I could live without. But I couldn't. Standing there, I felt like I had been erased, as if my years of sacrifice had been nothing more than background noise to a life where I was never the center of anyone's story. My hands shook as I tried to keep my composure, clutching onto the small tokens of my dream, pretending I was strong enough to stand tall. But inside, I was breaking. Every smile I had given over the years, every late night spent worrying about bills that weren't even mine, every holiday I made special, every dollar saved so they could have more, it all came crashing down in that one empty room. I realized I wasn't invisible by accident. I had been made invisible by the people I loved. I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask them why my presence never seemed enough, why my milestones never mattered the way theirs did. But the truth is, they weren't there to answer. They had chosen comfort over commitment, ease over effort, and someone else over me. And the cruelest part, they probably didn't even see it as betrayal. To them, it was just another ordinary day. To me, it was the day the ground shifted beneath my feet. I kept reminding myself not to cry. Not here, not now. But the tears threatened anyway, stinging at the corners of my eyes. I swallowed them down, because I'd learned a long time ago that weakness didn't earn sympathy. It only gave people another reason to dismiss you. So, I straightened my shoulders, smiled politely at strangers who didn't know what was happening in my chest, and tried to act as though the absence of my family wasn't tearing me apart. It's strange how betrayal doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it whispers. Sometimes, it shows up as a phone call that never came, a seat that stays empty, or laughter shared in another room where you were never invited. And in those moments, the silence hurts more than any harsh word ever could. As I stood there, I felt the weight of years pressing down on me. Years of giving, of showing up, of being the one everyone leaned on. I thought about how often I'd been told to be patient, to understand, to forgive. I thought about how many times I'd excused their absence or minimized my own needs because family came first. But in that moment, I couldn't escape the truth. Family only seemed to come first when it was convenient for them. That day wasn't just about being overlooked. It was about realizing that my sacrifices had been so common, so expected, that they no longer held any meaning. I wasn't just hurt. I was changed. Because once you see the truth clearly, you can never go back to the way things were. And believe me, this betrayal didn't come out of nowhere. It wasn't an isolated event. It was the final straw in a lifetime of moments where I had quietly given and quietly been forgotten. If you want to understand why this one moment shattered me so deeply, you need to know the story behind it the years of sacrifice that led to this breaking point. And that's where it all begins. When I look back over the years, I sometimes wonder how I managed to carry so much without ever asking for anything in return. My story isn't one of grand adventures or personal victories. It's a story of quiet sacrifices, of showing up every single day because my family needed me. I was still young when my husband walked away, leaving me with 2 children and a stack of bills that never seemed to stop arriving. I didn't have the luxury of falling apart. I worked days in the classroom, nights tutoring, weekends covering shifts wherever I could. I told myself it was temporary, that one day it would get easier. But the truth is, I lived decades in survival mode. Every decision I made was about giving my children a chance at a life better than mine. I remember the years of late nights, falling asleep over grading papers, only to wake up before dawn to pack lunches and get everyone out the door. I paid their college tuitions by picking up every extra job I could find, scraping together money from tutoring, summer school, and even cleaning offices when teaching didn't cover the bills. I didn't mind. I told myself this was what a mother does. Weddings came next, and again. I reached deep into my savings to help them celebrate properly. When they wanted to buy their first homes, I quietly pulled from the account I had been building for my own retirement. I told myself I could always work a little longer, save a little harder, because nothing mattered more than seeing them secure and happy. It wasn't just money, it was time, too. I babysat the grandchildren more hours than I could ever count after school. Weekends, nights when emergencies came up, I learned to juggle schedules, to rearrange my own plans, to be there whenever they called. And they called often, not to ask how I was doing, but to ask if I could watch the kids, or help with errands, or cover another expense. And I always said yes, because that's who I was, the reliable one, the one they could lean on. I didn't complain. I convinced myself that this was my role, that maybe being needed was enough to feel loved. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. My children grew comfortable with the idea that I would always be there, that my sacrifices were simply part of the background of their lives. They stopped noticing. They stopped asking about me. I was no longer a mother with dreams and needs of my own. I was a resource, a safety net, a fixture that didn't require acknowledgement. The truth is, I enabled it. I thought if I kept giving, eventually they would see me. Eventually, they would appreciate what I had done. But appreciation never came. Instead, the more I gave, the less visible I became. Now, sitting with the memory of that most recent betrayal, I can see the pattern so clearly. Years of sacrifices that went unacknowledged, years of love that went unreturned, and I can feel something inside me shifting. For the first time in decades, I'm not sure I can keep pretending that this is enough. A breaking point is coming, and this time, I don't think I'll be the one bending. I remember sitting in my living room after that day, the silence pressing in on me like it had something to prove. The house was filled with reminders of all the roles I had played for everyone else, framed photos of smiling children, thank you cards signed in a hurry, trinkets from family vacations I had helped pay for, but was never really part of. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel pride when I looked at them. I felt hollow. That was the moment it hit me. I had spent decades pouring myself into everyone else's lives, but almost nothing of me remained in my own. I was the dependable mother, the doting grandmother, the reliable friend. But Sarah, the woman with dreams, with passions, with a voice she had been buried under obligations so long that even I had forgotten she existed. It's funny how clarity often comes in the ugliest moments. Betrayal has a way of cutting through the noise, leaving only the sharp truth behind. And the truth was simple. I was tired of being invisible, tired of waiting for appreciation that would never come, tired of making myself smaller so others could shine. That night, I poured myself a glass of wine I had been saving for a celebration that never came. I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook, the same kind I used to grade papers in, and for the first time in years, I began writing not about lesson plans, not about to-do lists, but about me, what I had given, what I had lost, and most importantly, what I still had left. And that's when I realized something that both shocked and empowered me. I wasn't nearly as powerless as I had allowed myself to believe. My years of sacrifice hadn't just drained me. They had also left me with strength, with resilience, and even with resources. The house was mine, paid off with decades of steady work. My retirement account was healthy because I had always been cautious, always planning for the future. I had savings, investments, and even an inheritance I had tucked away quietly, never mentioning it to my children because I knew how quickly their needs could swallow it whole. For years, I thought my only value came from what I could give to them. But looking at those numbers, that house, that quiet stability, I realized something powerful. I had been building a foundation for myself all along. I wasn't dependent. I wasn't trapped. I had choices that could change everything. It was like something inside me cracked open. The sorrow I felt from being abandoned at such an important moment started shifting into something else: resolve. I had spent a lifetime teaching my children lessons about responsibility, love, and sacrifice. But maybe it was time to teach them one more lesson, the most important of all, that I was not to be taken for granted. That night, I made a silent promise to myself. No more being invisible. No more waiting on their approval to validate my existence. I wasn't just a mother or a grandmother. I was a woman with strength, with dignity, with the power to decide what happened next. And what happened next was going to be different. Very different. I closed that notebook knowing I was no longer just documenting my pain. I was drafting a new chapter. And this time, I would be the one writing the story. The next morning, I woke with an unusual calm, a clarity. For once, I wasn't waiting for anyone else to change. I was ready to take action myself. And that's exactly what I did. Once the decision was made, I felt something shift inside me. For the first time in years, I wasn't reacting to everyone else's needs. I was planning for myself. And not just planning, but plotting with precision. Revenge, some might call it justice. I started with the simplest step: gathering records, old receipts, bank statements, copies of tuition payments, even the checks I had written for down payments on their homes. Each document was a reminder of how deeply I had invested in their futures while neglecting my own. Seeing it all laid out on paper was like staring at a quiet testimony of my life, nearly $200,000 in direct financial support, not including the years of unpaid babysitting. I didn't keep those numbers for bitterness. I kept them as proof. Next came the legal side. I scheduled an appointment with my lawyer, the same man who had helped me through the divorce decades ago. He had been reminding me for years to update my will, and now I finally had clarity about what needed to be done. I decided to restructure everything: Create educational trusts for the grandchildren with conditions attached. Reroute donations to causes I truly cared about. And make sure that my children would no longer see me as their endless safety net. I wanted every move to be deliberate, leaving no room for misinterpretation. So I also contacted the bank's trust department. I learned how to establish funds that couldn't be touched unless certain conditions were met, conditions like genuine connection, regular contact, simple gestures of love that most people take for granted. It wasn't about punishing anyone. It was about forcing them to recognize what real family should look like. What fueled me through this process wasn't rage, it was clarity. While my children spent their days assuming I would always be there, I was carefully redrawing the map of their future without them even knowing it. They carried on with their routines, blissfully unaware that their choices had cost them far more than they could imagine. The irony was almost poetic. I took quiet satisfaction in the secrecy. Every step was calm, calculated, controlled. They thought I was still the same woman who could be brushed aside, the same mother who would accept scraps of attention. But while they ignored me, I was building something stronger than their indifference, a plan that would outlast their assumptions. Even the small details mattered. I sorted through my belongings, deciding what would go to charity, what would go to my sister, and what would never be touched by children who couldn't remember my favorite color. I began making lists, not of groceries or chores, but of boundaries. Each entry was a line drawn in the sand, marking the end of my invisibility. And as I worked, I noticed how different I felt. Calm, almost serene. This wasn't chaos or desperation, it was strategy. And there's something powerful about a woman who finally realizes she has nothing left to lose and everything to gain by standing up for herself. I knew the day would come when they would discover what I had done. The confrontation was inevitable, and when that moment arrived, they would see a side of me they had never believed existed. The fuse had been lit. All that was left was to wait for the explosion. It started with small cracks in their confidence. A few missed calls I didn't return. A couple of vague answers when they asked if I was free. For years, they had grown used to me answering immediately, rearranging my life at the slightest request. So when I didn't, they noticed. At first, it was mild concern. Then it became panic. They began circling around me with questions I no longer felt obligated to answer. I could sense the shift in their tone, the unease that something had changed, though they couldn't put their finger on it. They knew me as dependable, predictable. What unsettled them most wasn't anger or shouting. It was my silence. And then the moment came. The confrontation. They arrived at my door together, their faces a mix of confusion, frustration, and fear. I invited them in with the same calmness I had carried all week, while they fidgeted with nervous energy. They spoke quickly, their words tumbling over each other, desperate to know what was going on. I sat there in my own living room, steady as stone, and finally laid it all out. The updated will. The trusts set aside for the grandchildren, but only if they maintained a genuine relationship with me. The donations already in motion to the library, the food bank, the animal shelter. The remainder shifted to people and causes who had shown me love without conditions. The room fell into silence so heavy it seemed to press against the walls. I watched the color drain from their faces as the reality sank in. They had assumed I was their forever safety net, the invisible foundation of their lives. But now, they were staring at the truth the foundation had moved. Their voices rose, first in disbelief, Then in desperation, questions, accusations, even tears. They tried to convince me I was overreacting, that I had misunderstood, that family didn't keep score, but I had never been calmer in my life. I wasn't reacting out of rage. I was standing in clarity. For once, the weight of proof was on them, not me. I could see their panic, but I didn't match it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend myself. I simply explained, with the same composure I once used to teach lessons in the classroom, that love without respect wasn't love at all. That I had spent decades proving mine, and now it was their turn to prove theirs. And in that moment, the balance of power shifted. For years, I had been the one chasing scraps of attention, but now they were the ones scrambling for footing. Watching them struggle to grasp that they could no longer take me for granted brought a quiet satisfaction I can hardly describe. I knew this wasn't the end, only the beginning. Families don't unravel or rebuild in a single conversation. But the shock on their faces told me one thing: they finally saw me, not as a background character in their lives, but as someone capable of changing the script entirely. As I closed the door behind them that evening, my house returned to its usual silence. Only this time, it wasn't heavy or suffocating. It was peaceful. I knew the confrontation had left them reeling, and deep down, I also knew something else. There was still another revelation they hadn't seen coming, and that twist would change everything. Just when I thought I had reached the end of this story, life handed me a revelation I never saw coming. It was an ordinary morning, the kind where I expected nothing more than coffee and quiet. But tucked in the back of a drawer I hadn't opened in years, I found an envelope with my name written in handwriting I hadn't seen since before the divorce. It was from my ex-husband. I froze, my hands trembling as I slid the paper out. The letter was dated just a few months before he passed away. In it, he admitted what I had always known but never heard him say: that he failed me, that he failed our children, and that no amount of distance or silence could erase the truth of my sacrifices. But then came the part that made my breath catch. He had left behind a separate account, one I never knew about, with nearly $800,000 earmarked only for me. Not for the kids, not for anyone else, just me. It wasn't the money that shook me, it was the words. He wrote that he had watched from afar, seen how the children leaned on me without giving back, and how I carried more than any one person should have to carry. He begged me not to give away this last piece of security, not to sacrifice it in the name of being needed, but to keep it for myself. His words were raw, filled with regret, and for the first time in decades, I felt seen by the one person who had abandoned me the most. In that moment, all of my carefully built plans seemed to take on a new dimension. The trusts, the donations, the restructuring of my will, they were no longer acts of revenge. They were acts of protection, not just for me, but for the values I wanted to leave behind. The letter reframed everything. I wasn't punishing my family. I was safeguarding my own worth, finally honoring the years I had given away without acknowledgement. And yet, the irony was undeniable. The man who had once left me to shoulder everything alone had, in the end, left me the gift of freedom, the ability to choose, without guilt, how my final chapters would be written. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it back into the envelope. My story wasn't about loss anymore. It was about discovery, about reclaiming the parts of myself that had been forgotten. And as I sat there in the quiet, I realized I had one more lesson to share, one final truth to leave behind. That truth would shape not only my legacy, but also the way I chose to live the rest of my days. Looking back on everything, I realized the betrayal that broke me open was also the turning point that set me free. For so long, I believed my worth came only from what I gave my time, my money, my presence. But I understand now that love without respect is not love at all, and that boundaries are not walls. They are doorways that show people how to enter your life with care. I don't regret the sacrifices I made. They shaped me. They gave my children opportunities, and they taught me resilience. But I do regret how long it took me to see that being invisible isn't the price of being loved. It's the result of forgetting to love yourself first. The letter I found reminded me of something profound. Sometimes the people we least expect can offer us truth, even if it comes too late for them to live it themselves. My ex-husband's words, my own planning, and the shock on my family's faces, all of it led me to the same lesson. That true family is not defined by entitlement, but by reciprocity, respect, and the willingness to show up. Today, I no longer feel like the forgotten background character in someone else's story. I feel like the author of my own. And if there's one thing I want anyone listening to take away from this, it's this: never let anyone convince you that your worth depends on their recognition. You matter because you exist, because you give, because you breathe, and you are allowed to set the terms of how others treat you. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your experiences in the comments. Let others know they're not alone. And if you found meaning here, please like this video and subscribe. Your voice matters. Because at the end of the day, sometimes the greatest story we can tell is the one where we finally learn to value ourselves.